Hello, I'm Dr. Linda Reed. Welcome to the Medicine for the Layman series at the National Institutes of Health. Today we're going to be listening to Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's going to be talking about AIDS, the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome.
We keep hearing about how we're in uncharted waters with COVID-19, which is true. You'd have to be even older than an American presidential candidate to have seen a pandemic of this scale before, but it's not accurate to say that this is all new territory. For those of us that have been knocking around the world of medicine for a while now, or those with an interest in history, there's a lot about this that's eerily familiar. We've been here before, and we didn't really learn. People in countries like the UK and US have been expending energy shouting at their respective governments for their responses to the pandemic. But the truth is that the damage was done a long time before a bat, a pangolin and a human decided to have a three-way in Wuhan. Scientists have been warning that it was only a matter of time before a virus like this went on a world tour, and they were ignored. What's worse, in many countries they saw their funding cut. Governments have been ignoring scientists saying things they didn't want to hear since time immemorial, so why would it be any different now? Enjoy your time in the sun, epidemiologists. Once this is all over, people are going to go right back to not knowing who you are and caring more about Kylie Jenner than Edward Jenner. Society had become complacent. We whooped so many diseases, RNA asses, that a pandemic simply wasn't a realistic concern. In very recent memory, we dealt with a previously unseen virus that started killing people without a cure in sight, could be spread by unwitting asymptomatic carriers. The government dragged their feet before finally suggesting that covering up might prevent its spread. Minority groups were worst affected, leading to inaccurate speculation. Desperate people started turning to unproven therapies. Conspiracy theorists cashed in. The British eventually ran a landmark treatment trial, and at the heart of the battle against this virus was a certain Anthony Fauci. I don't mean SARS-1 or H1N1, I'm of course talking about HIV and AIDS. I've always been fascinated by this period in history, I think partly because most medical historians tend to gravitate towards the truly wild, olden days of medicine when doctors were clearly just legal trolls that competed with each other to invent the most ridiculous ideas and pretend that they were therapies. Goat testicles surgically inserted inside your scrotum? Yes please, I'll take two. So more recent history often gets a bit overlooked, even though it was just as momentous. Of course, Fauci isn't the only public official involved with COVID-19 that was also involved in the response to HIV. Dr. Deborah Birx is the current White House Coronavirus Response Coordinator and worked on HIV and AIDS at the NIH in the 80s. And Vice President Mike Pence, who chairs the same committee, undermined government policy meant to curb the spread of HIV when he was governor of Indiana, delaying the implementation of preventative measures, making an outbreak worse than it should have been. Indiana's response is regarded as a key failure in dealing with a virus, and Pence is now in charge of America's response to COVID-19. The pace at which HIV spread was totally different to COVID, of course, but the parallels of countries ignoring red flags popping up all over the world and reassuring people that there have only been a few cases to the current situation are striking. There aren't many currently practicing household names in medicine. Anthony Fauci is about as close as they come. His name adorns the monstrous tome in every medical student's room. He has dedicated his life to medical research and policy, and I've been aghast by the vitriol directed towards him, not only from the public that he serves, but from within the White House itself. He's been the subject of memes and conspiracy theories similar to ones about Bill Gates or George Soros, that he's some nefarious puppet master. But they're billionaires. He's a doctor, a researcher. I wondered how he stays so unfazed by it. Well, because this isn't his first rodeo. Many Americans died from HIV because the government moved too slowly. That is true, and Fauci himself found himself in the firing line. Activist Larry Kramer took out a full-page ad in the paper calling Fauci an incompetent idiot and a murderer. And just like today, he was branded a pill-pushing stooge of the pharmaceutical industry. But what Fauci did next was unprecedented. He sat down with the protesters, he listened to them, and he changed policy, ensuring that the normally slow-moving wheels of the FDA sped up. Kramer would go on to call him the only true and great hero amongst government officials. and the two became friends. Fauci is an uncommonly virtuous public figure. Not much bothers me, but I've been really disheartened to see this man painted as a bad guy. At a time when many scientists have been showing their own inherent biases on either side of the political spectrum, Fauci has been an incredibly neutral voice. He's one of the only medics willing to say that all mass gatherings run the risk of spreading coronavirus, whether spring breakers or Black Lives Matter protesters. Reagan's government was accused of not caring about LGBTQ and immigrant communities, who were bearing the brunt of HIV's devastating effects, just the same way Trump's government is accused of indifference to the plight of minority groups today. Scientists started speculating on why gay men and other marginalized communities seem to be worst affected, and came up with all kinds of theories that seem daft to us today. It's the exact same pattern we're seeing with COVID-19, which I've talked about in a previous video, but essentially health outcomes always mirror social factors. Furthermore, initial reports about HIV gave the impression that it was only the 4 H's who were at risk: Haitians, heroin users, haemophiliacs, and homosexuals. Indeed, the very first report of the disease was a case series of 5 gay men afflicted with a mysterious new illness, and from then on it was known as the gay plague. This led the wider public to believe that they weren't at risk. Sound familiar? From the offset, we were told that only the elderly and the infirm were at risk of COVID-19. Now, the elderly are at highest risk from COVID, but their risk is not theirs alone. One thing I've been asked about a bit after recent videos on race is vitamin D. Now, I didn't want to make a whole video about it, so I'll briefly mention it here because it's yet another example of familiar territory. In essence, a lot of people have leapt on the vitamin D bandwagon to explain why people with darker skin have died from COVID-19 more than white people. It seems logical enough. Low vitamin D levels are associated with more severe COVID-19, and darker skinned people do have higher rates of vitamin D deficiency. I know several prominent people on the internet have latched upon it, and many just assume it's proven fact, just like a global game of Chinese whispers. Okay, perhaps that's not the best idiom to choose. To those familiar with medical research in various fields over recent years, this is a false dawn. The same theory has been proposed for stroke, falls, asthma, heart disease, and many more. There's no end of studies where they've looked at people's vitamin D levels and found it correlates with severity of disease, any disease. In each case, it led people to ask if low vitamin D was predisposing patients to whatever the disease being studied was. But correlation is not causation. Vitamin D levels drop in the elderly, and what those many previous studies have shown is that vitamin D is a marker of frailty, not a cause, and frailty makes you more susceptible to all disease. Should you ensure that you're not vitamin D deficient? Of course, but it's not the reason that more black people are dying from COVID. Another analogous situation between the 1980s and now is a lack of trust in the government. Testing and tracing was key to stopping HIV spread, just as it is for COVID, but many resist it. Again, we're seeing trust, or lack thereof, being the main reason behind so many people today refusing to wear masks or accept a vaccine when it's available. Moving forward, there's another important lesson to learn from HIV, that of accepting a certain level of risk by modifying behavior rather than eliminating risk entirely. Safe sex and needle exchanges meant people could still do things they wanted to do with an acceptable level of safety, just as the way wearing masks and social distancing will allow businesses to reopen and leisure activities to restart. 4 long years would pass from the first reports of AIDS to a promising treatment becoming available. That drug was azithromycin, or AZT. It wasn't new, it was over 20 years old at that point, originally developed to combat cancer. It was a flop, to be honest, but AIDS gave it a new lease of life, just the way hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir were fairly ineffective drugs sitting on pharmacy shelves gathering dust until COVID breathed new life into their existence. AIDS was a disease with nearly 100% mortality. People were dying and they were desperate. So AZT did a roaring trade, but it wasn't the wonder drug that people had hoped for. And just like in the case of hydroxychloroquine, it was a British and French long-term, large-scale study in their socialized health services that gave us the answer. Fauci would later explain it would never have been possible in the US healthcare system, just as the recovery trial that I talked about in a recent video that proved dexamethasone's efficacy was not possible in the US. The Dallas Buyers Club is a nice film that's well worth a watch, but it depicts the AZT story in a very simplistic way, that the evil Big Pharma were profiting off an ineffective drug. In reality, it's never that black and white. It wasn't a cure, but 30 years on, AZT still has a role in HIV treatment. It's important to consider these grey areas that exist and will continue to exist when it comes to COVID-19 as well. So that's all well and good for what has already happened, but what can history inform us about what is still yet to come in the fight against coronavirus? When treatments do become available, the poorest will be at the back of the queue. The uninsured, those without access to healthcare around the world, marginalized populations. Remember, sub-Saharan Africa has been worst affected by HIV for the last 2-3 decades, in part because they weren't regarded as profitable and didn't get drugs that we had access to in the West for many years. In 2001, the director of the US Agency for International Development said Africans do not know what watches and clocks are and hence could not possibly take medication. What worked in the fight against HIV and AIDS was collaboration between communities and scientists, by people like Anthony Fauci and Larry Kramer working in partnership with one another, by the public understanding we're in this together, and everyone playing their part. None of this will work without trust. I personally believe a nudge strategy from governments as opposed to heavy-handed tactics will work best, but that only stands a chance if people genuinely care about each other. Try to see past the partisan politics and recognize there is an army of doctors and scientists working towards solving this. Just today we saw some encouraging vaccine news come out of Oxford, so please trust in science. Don't believe a random Facebook post or WhatsApp forward over an epidemiologist. Ultimately, we all want the same thing, for life to get back to normal. And the quickest way to do that is for us all to play our part. I guess what I'm trying to say is don't be a dick. I've not actually thought of a way to end this video. To be perfectly honest, I didn't think I'd get this far, because this must be like the 5th or 6th time I brought my camera into work thinking I'll just shoot a cheeky little video in a quiet moment, and I've never got past the introductory paragraph. So to be perfectly frank with you, I hadn't prepared for this eventuality, so please just imagine that I dazzled you with some witty repartee and a sarcastic, withering comment about the state of the world, and I didn't expose myself as someone who is actually unable to improvise any funny lines without planning them in advance. But it's 5 to 8, the night registrar is going to arrive any minute, and I have stopped caring. By now you'll probably have seen lots of videos of people wearing masks and showing that their oxygen saturations don't drop when wearing a mask, which is entirely true. So the oxygen saturations here are the bottom number, which is 99% at the moment. So I didn't think I really had much to add, but those videos are using the kinds of masks that the public are advised to wear, i.e. normal cloth coverings. There's no need to wear anything more specialist for the average person in public. However, in clinical settings, we have something called an FFP3 mask, which is much tighter fitting and harder to breathe in. And so I figured that I could demonstrate that even wearing one of those doesn't reduce your oxygen saturations, and I'll do it while exercising. And if that still doesn't convince you that masks don't affect your oxygen levels, then you probably don't actually want convincing. So let's start by just putting it on at rest. Now this is actually a valved mask, which again should not be worn by people in public, because this does not protect others from you, which is the main reason we're suggesting wearing masks. I appear to have died. This isn't really supporting my point. Okay, so still 99%. Now I'll do some exercise. So that was about a minute's worth of exercise. And you can see that my oxygen stats are still 99.